Well, thank you not only for the wonderful introductions, but also for the work of the cottage. I think we've seen over the last year and a half the dedication of the staff here at President Lincoln's Cottage and throughout the entire organization of the National Trust to really make this a living monument to that which happened here. And I think that, one of the things in looking through the anthology that really stood out to me was this vignette that Michael Pisker talks about in his essay, the walk of Anna Harrison Chase, known as Mama Chase in the neighborhood, from T Street over here to the cottage at age 92 in the mid-1930s. Coming here because she had heard when she was a girl in the refugee camps that they'd set up. I won't use the word that they used to describe those refugees, but the refugee camps that they had set up for the people who had escaped from slavery. Knowing that something was happening here, seeing President Lincoln on his horse going down to the White House during those summers, and knowing that she didn't want to die without having come to the cottage and seen where it was that he wrote the pieces of paper that it freed her and everyone else. I think that notion of place, that notion of meaning, the notion of people who were enslaved not only having agency. I know that there's a lot of people who have written a lot of things over the last 150 years as to whether people freed themselves or whether they patiently waited to be freed, and of course it's a mixture of everything. It's Frederick Douglass saying, I prayed for freedom for 20 years, but God never answered me until I prayed with my legs. It's the walk that the folks took down to the dock to get on the Pearl to try to leave in the middle of the night on their bid for freedom. But these are not just historical memories, historical moments. I think that we're often tricked into this notion that slavery is historical and that maybe you could go and do a reenactment of the Civil War battles, and there are even folks here in town that do wonderful reenactments of some of the spirituals and slavery songs and things like that. But that you could never really touch or never really experience, other than perhaps through the slave narratives that the WPA Writers Project and others did of the folks who had been born in slavery. You could never really touch the experience of slavery. And yet, I've had a chance in my previous life as a prosecutor and then also now at the State Department to meet so many people who have taken that walk to freedom on their own. People like Julia Gabriel, a Guatemalan woman who led 20 of her fellow farm workers across a swamp in Clarendon County, South Carolina, which has its own other civil rights history, certainly. But a woman who was enslaved with other Guatemalan migrant workers on fields that had been, over the last 200 years, tended by people in chattel slavery, tended by people in sharecropping relationships, and then eventually tended by people in modern slavery. The walk that Julia Gabriel and those other people made after they decided that if they stayed there, they would be killed, is the same walk. Different circumstances, certainly a different legal circumstance, a different historical circumstance, but it's the same walk full of hopes and dreams and uncertainty as the folks who walked down to the Georgetown waterfront to get on the plane. It's the walk to freedom. And if there's anything that I think that we bring to the fight now, whether it's the State Department as a coordinator of the U.S. government action, whether it's the bold words that you heard from President Obama on the anniversary of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September, that we would dedicate ourselves to this fight, to this promise that was made in this room. It is that notion that we're not talking about a civil right that is enforced solely to go after the badges and incidents of slavery. We're talking about slavery. When I was a prosecutor, I would stand up in court and I would say that I was representing the United States of America and that this person had violated the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation are meaningless if we do not actually enforce them. If we do not find and help the victims of modern slavery, and if we do not use the tools that originated in this House to punish those who would bring back that ancient evil. And I think that that's what we're seeing today. The work of civil rights attorneys, not just anymore in the Justice Department, in the Civil Rights Division's criminal section. The Southern Poverty Law Center just about a month ago got a $4.5 million judgment on behalf of a number of men who were enslaved in shipyards and welding. On behalf of teachers, people who thought they were coming to the United States under guest worker programs and instead were held in servitude. So I think that that's what we've seen is if the Southern Poverty Law Center, if the Civil Rights Division, if the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is seeing this and is working on this, then it truly tells us that the fight, while not yet over, is not going undone. The legacy that we have continues. About 50 years ago, Pete Daniels, who had a wonderful career at the Smithsonian after, did some of the most important work in the archives as far as the peonage cases in the 1930s and 1940s, etc. And when you look at the stories, you look at the letters that he was able to uncover, letters to Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP, with mothers writing saying, they came and they took my son and they said that he'd have a better job if he went up to the mines in West Virginia, and I haven't heard from him for 2 years. Please help me find my son. Those are the same stories. Those are the same worry and wonder that families have around the world today. They were the same stories and the same worry and wonder that people had 150 years ago. The difference between 150 years ago this week and 150 years ago several weeks ago is that when the Emancipation Proclamation went into force, those who would hold another as slave were not given cheer by the government, were not given sanction by the government, were not supported by the government, but were from then and therefore on criminals. When we talk about the notion of that they shall be then and from now on forever free, the flip side of that is those who violate that will then and therefore on be criminal. And I think that changing that up and thinking about what that means for civil rights. I'm going to close simply by saying that in the international realm, we often have a tough discussion with countries when we say, if you're going to protect this most basic of human rights, we've spent much of the last 80 years talking much more about 14th and 15th Amendment jurisprudence, and I think for a reason. Part of it is that the Supreme Court finally, in the late 40s, did the right thing as far as the 13th Amendment, and we moved on. But slavery exists. Slavery persists. And if we're not willing to confront, bring it back so that it's not the lost civil right, but to think of the right to freedom, set forth in the Emancipation Proclamation, set forth in the 13th Amendment, and set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is the first civil right from which all things flow. Housing, education, voting, police misconduct, racial profiling, equal pay, all of the things that we work on don't start when people are enslaved. So let's rededicate ourselves today in this place. And let's do so in the way that Esteban Real y Galvez from the Trust talked about in this room last year. He interviewed a granddaughter of a woman who was enslaved on the frontier, an Indian woman who had been taken from her Navajo village and enslaved in a Hispanic family, who was freed by the army, and in the 1930s told her granddaughter, "They say that a man named Lincoln set me free. I only wish I'd been able to thank him.